You have the right to remain silent. The metal cuffs bit into Marcus Washington's wrists as flashbulbs exploded around him, reporters shouting questions he couldn't process. 20 minutes ago, he'd been straightening his tie in the federal courthouse bathroom, preparing to accept the Presidential Medal for Human Rights Advocacy. Now he was being perp-walked down the marble steps like a common criminal. "This is a mistake," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm supposed to be in ceremonial courtroom A in 10 minutes. Detective Ray Reynolds tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. "Save it for the judge, pal. You're not talking your way out of this one." The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Marcus had spent 15 years walking up these same courthouse steps, fighting to free innocent men from prison. He'd personally overturned 43 wrongful convictions, most of them black men railroaded by a system that saw guilt before evidence. And now that same system had its claws in him. A reporter thrust a microphone toward his face. "Mr. Washington, did you plant the device that threatened federal Judge Morrison?" Marcus's blood ran cold. A bomb threat against federal Judge Elizabeth Morrison, whom he'd worked with on prison reform initiatives. The woman had become an ally, even a friend, in his crusade for justice. "I would never," Marcus started, but Reynolds yanked him forward. "Keep moving. Terrorist." The word hit like a physical blow. Marcus stumbled, caught himself, and lifted his chin. In the crowd of gawking faces and clicking cameras, he spotted a familiar figure. Sarah Chen, his lead investigator, pushed through the throng of reporters, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Marcus," she called out, "don't say anything. I'm calling David right now." David Reeves, his longtime attorney and friend. At least, someone believed in his innocence. Marcus tried to catch Sarah's eye, to communicate everything he couldn't say aloud. Find out who did this, find out why, and find out fast. Because Marcus Washington knew one thing with absolute certainties, had orchestrated this moment, someone who understood the symbolic power of destroying a civil rights advocate on the very day he was to be honored by the President of the United States. As they reached the police cruiser, Marcus caught a glimpse of the courthouse's upper windows. Behind one of them, he knew, sat Presidential Medal for Human Rights Advocacy, waiting on a mahogany table for a recipient who would never arrive. The detective shoved him into the back seat, and Marcus closed his eyes. 15 years of fighting injustice, and now he was about to experience it firsthand. The car pulled away from the courthouse, and Marcus opened his eyes to see the building growing smaller in the rear window, but he didn't see defeat in that image. He saw a challenge. They had no idea who they were messing with. The fluorescent lights in interview room 3 cast everything in sickly yellow. Marcus sat with his hands folded, watching Detective Reynolds pace like a caged animal. 3 hours had passed since the arrest, and his lawyers still hadn't been allowed in. "Let's go through this one more time," Reynolds said, sliding a manila folder across the scarred metal table. At 9:47 a.m., a device was discovered in Judge Morrison's chambers. Bomb squad confirmed it was real. "Your prints were on the packaging." Marcus didn't touch the folder. "My prints are on file because I've worked in that courthouse for 50 years. I've been in Judge Morrison's chambers dozens of times. Right? The perfect cover." Reynolds leaned forward, his coffee breath washing over Marcus. "You civil rights types are all the same. Start thinking you're above the law you claim to protect." "Detective Reynolds," Marcus's voice remained calm, professional. "You're making a mistake that's going to embarrass this department." Reynolds opened the folder, revealing a photograph of a package addressed to Judge Morrison. Anonymous tip came in at 9:15. Caller said to check her chambers for a device planted by that rights lawyer Washington. Lo and behold, there it was. Marcus studied the photo. The package looked innocuous enough: brown paper, neat handwriting, but something nagged at him. The address label was too perfect, too deliberate. "Who made the call?" Voice was disguised. "Probably you, trying to throw us off." "That makes no sense. Why would I call in my own bomb?" Reynolds slammed his palm on the table. "Because you people love the attention. You love playing the victim." The mask slipped then, and Marcus saw what he was really dealing with. This wasn't about evidence or procedure. This was about something much deeper and more dangerous. "Detective," Marcus said quietly, "what case did I work that you're still angry about?" Reynolds froze mid-pace. "What are you talking about? You didn't know who I was when you arrested me, but you do now, and you're angrier than the situation warrants." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Which innocent man did I help get out of prison? Which conviction did I overturn that you worked on?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Jason Hartwell," Reynolds finally said. "You got Jason Hartwell released." There it was. Marcus remembered the case: a 22-year-old black man convicted of armed robbery on questionable eyewitness testimony. The real perpetrator had confessed years later, but it had taken months of legal wrangling to get Hartwell released. Hartwell was innocent, Marcus said. The real robber confessed. Hartwell was a punk who belonged in prison. Maybe not for that robbery, but for something. Reynolds's face flushed red. I spent 2 years building that case. You spent 2 years building the wrong case, and you made me look like a fool in front of the whole department. Marcus felt a flicker of understanding. Reynolds wasn't just a racist cop though, he was certainly that. He was a man whose professional pride had been wounded, whose sense of certainty had been shattered. In Reynolds's mind, Marcus wasn't just a civil rights lawyer, he was the enemy of order itself. The door opened, and David Reeves walked in, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the emergency. Behind him came Sarah Chen, carrying a thick file folder. Detective Reynolds, David said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades practicing law. This interview is over. Like hell it is. My client has been in custody for 3 hours without representation. Any evidence gathered during this interrogation is inadmissible. Reynolds looked like he wanted to argue, but he stepped back. David took the chair next to Marcus, while Sarah remained standing. Marcus, David said, don't say another word. Sarah has some information that's going to interest everyone in this room. Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. This was taken at 9:30 a.m. today, 17 minutes before the device was allegedly discovered. She placed it on the table. The photograph showed Marcus on the courthouse steps, shaking hands with Congressman James Mitchell. The timestamp was clearly visible, 9 hours, 30 minutes, and 47 seconds. Judge Morrison's chambers are on the 7th floor. Sarah continued. Building security confirms the elevators were backed up this morning due to a maintenance issue. It would have taken a minimum of 20 minutes to get from the courthouse steps to the 7th floor. Reynolds studied the photograph, his confident expression wavering. Furthermore, Sarah said, producing another document, Marcus was scheduled to meet with the congressman at 9:30 to discuss the ceremony. This meeting was arranged 3 weeks ago and confirmed yesterday. David leaned forward. Detective, my client was in full view of multiple witnesses, including a United States congressman, at the time this device was allegedly planted. Either he's developed the ability to be in 2 places at once, or someone is trying to frame him. Marcus watched Reynolds process this information. The detective's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that might have been doubt. The anonymous tip, Marcus said, play the recording. We don't have to. You do if you want to maintain any credibility in this case. Reynolds looked toward the one-way mirror, probably seeking guidance from a superior. After a long moment, he reached for his phone and dialed an extension. Yeah, it's Reynolds. I need the recording from this morning. The Morrison tip. He waited, then put the phone on speaker. The voice that filled the room was electronically distorted, but the words were clear. Judge Morrison has a bomb in her chambers, planted by that rights lawyer Washington. Better check it out before someone gets hurt. Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him. David was already taking notes. Interesting choice of words, David said. The caller specifically identified Marcus before you'd even responded to the scene. Would an anonymous tipster know who planted the device unless they planted it themselves? Reynolds ended the call. This doesn't prove anything. It proves someone wanted Marcus specifically implicated. Sarah pulled out another photograph, and this proves it wasn't Marcus. The second photograph showed a man in maintenance coveralls, entering the federal courthouse through a service entrance. The timestamp read 8:45 a.m. The man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but his build and gait were clearly different from Marcus's. Building security provided this after I explained the situation, Sarah said. This man entered the building 45 minutes before Marcus arrived, used a service elevator to access the 7th floor, and left through the same entrance 12 minutes later. David gathered the photographs. Detective Reynolds, you have a choice. You can continue pursuing charges against my client based on circumstantial evidence that's already falling apart, or you can start looking for the real perpetrator. Reynolds stared at the evidence, his jaw working soundlessly. Marcus could see the calculation in the man's eyes, professional obligation, warring with personal animosity. This doesn't change the fact that his prints were on the package, Reynolds finally said. No, Marcus agreed. But it raises the question of how they got there, because Marcus was beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. Someone had not only planted a bomb and framed him for it, they'd done so with intimate knowledge of his schedule, his work, and his relationship with Judge Morrison. This wasn't random. This was personal, and whoever was behind it had just made the biggest mistake of their life. Judge Patricia Hawthorne's courtroom felt like a coliseum, packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of a prominent attorney in shackles. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit. the presidential medal ceremony now a fading memory from 18 hours ago. Your Honor, David Reeves addressed the bench. We request immediate release on recognizance. Mr. Washington has deep ties to this community, an unblemished record, and Mr. Reeves. Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Your client stands accused of planting an explosive device in a federal courthouse. This court is not inclined toward leniency. Marcus studied the judge's face, searching for some sign of fairness. Patricia Hawthorne was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to weigh everything and find it wanting. He'd appeared before her only once, years ago, and something about her demeanor now felt off. Assistant Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh stood. Your Honor, the state requests remand without bail. Mr. Washington represents a clear and present danger to the judicial system he has spent years undermining. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Marcus felt Sarah Chin shift in the seat behind him, her anger palpable. Undermining. David's voice rose. My client has worked within the system to correct its mistakes. He's freed 43 innocent men who were convicted by juries of their peers. Walsh interrupted. Mr. Washington has made a career of second-guessing the courts, and now he's escalated to violence. There's no evidence of violence. David shot back. The device was discovered before it could detonate. My client was elsewhere when it was planted, and enough. Judge Hawthorne raised her hand. Mr. Reeves, your client's alibi is noted. However, the evidence of his prints on the package, combined with his history of antagonistic behavior toward this court system, suggests a high probability of guilt. Marcus leaned forward. Something in the judge's tone, the way she said antagonistic behavior, triggered a memory. He whispered to David, ask her to recuse herself. David frowned. On what grounds? Trust me. David stood. Your Honor, defense moves for recusal based on potential conflict of interest. Judge Hawthorne's face went rigid. Explain yourself. Counselor, we believe Your Honor may have a personal interest in this case that could compromise impartiality. I resent the implication. The case of People versus Brian Hawthorne. 2018, Marcus said, rising despite David's restraining hand. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hawthorne's knuckles went white as she gripped her gavel. Mr. Washington, you will sit down and remain silent. Your Honor convicted Brian Hawthorne of manslaughter in a hit-and-run case. I successfully appealed that conviction when new evidence emerged showing the actual driver was bailiff. Judge Hawthorne's voice cracked like a whip. Remove the defendant, but Marcus pressed on as the bailiff approached. Brian Hawthorne was your brother, wasn't he, Your Honor? And you believed he was guilty even after I proved his innocence. The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes while photographers snapped pictures of Judge Hawthorne's face, which had gone pale with fury. Clear the courtroom, she shouted over the din. All spectators out. Now, as bailiffs herded people toward the exits, David grabbed Marcus's arm. Why didn't you tell me about this? I didn't remember until she started talking about antagonistic behavior, Marcus said quietly. She's been waiting for a chance to get back at me. Judge Hawthorne waited until the last reporter was removed before speaking again. Mr. Washington, your outburst demonstrates exactly the kind of contempt for this court that makes you a danger to society. Your Honor, David said carefully, given the defendant's revelation about your family connection to his previous cases, don't you think recusal would be appropriate? My personal life has no bearing on my ability to interpret the law, but her voice lacked conviction. However, I will take your motion under advisement. In the meantime, Walsh interjected, the state maintains its request for remand. Marcus watched Judge Hawthorne wrestle with the decision. She could grant bail and appear fair, knowing it would look bad to keep him locked up on what was increasingly shaky evidence. Or she could deny bail and risk having her bias exposed if the case fell apart. Bail is set at $5 million, she finally said. Cash only. The number landed like a physical blow. $5 million in cash was impossible for most people, and Judge Hawthorne knew it. She was legally granting bail while functionally denying it. David shot to his feet. Your Honor, that amount is excessive and punitive. The amount reflects the severity of the charges and the defendant's demonstrated disrespect for this court. Judge Hawthorne's eyes fixed on Marcus. Perhaps time in custody will teach Mr. Washington the humility he's never learned. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Marcus caught sight of Sarah in the gallery. She was furiously typing on her phone, probably alerting civil rights organizations and media contacts. The story would be everywhere within the hour. Prominent civil rights lawyer denied reasonable bail by judge whose family he'd once embarrassed. Your Honor, Marcus said as the cuffs clicked into place. Justice delayed is justice denied. You taught me that in law school textbooks written by judges who understood what fairness meant. Judge Hawthorne's jaw tightened. Take him away. As they led him from the courtroom, Marcus heard David calling out, "We'll have this overturned by morning." But Marcus knew better. The system was designed to move slowly, to wear down those who challenged it. He'd spent years exploiting its procedural weaknesses to free innocent clients. Now those same weaknesses were being used against him. The holding cell door clanged shut, and Marcus sat on the narrow bench. Around him, other inmates watched with curious eyes. Word traveled fast in jail. Everyone knew who he was and why he was there. "Hey, lawyer man," called a voice from the next cell. "You really plant a bomb?" "No," Marcus said simply. "Then why you in here?" Marcus leaned his head against the cold concrete wall. "Because someone's afraid of what I represent." But as he sat, in the growing darkness, Marcus began to understand something else. Whoever had orchestrated this knew the system as well as he did. They'd known exactly which judge to manipulate, which prosecutor to influence, which strings to pull. This wasn't just about silencing one civil rights lawyer. This was about sending a message to every advocate, every reformer, every person who dared to challenge injustice. The message was clear. We can destroy you anytime we want. But they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed that putting Marcus Washington behind bars would silence him. Instead, they'd just given him the motivation to bring down their entire operation. Sarah Chin's apartment looked like a war room at 3 a.m. Coffee cups littered every surface. Files covered the dining table, and 3 laptops hummed with activity. David Reeves sat slumped in an armchair, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from 36 hours of non-stop work. "Tell me you found something," David said, as Sarah entered carrying another pot of coffee. "Better than something." Sarah sat at her primary workstation, fingers flying across the keyboard. "I found everything." On the main screen, she pulled up a series of photographs showing the maintenance worker entering the federal courthouse. But these weren't the grainy security images from before. These were crystal clear shots from traffic cameras, ATM security systems, and cell phone towers. "Our bomber made a mistake," Sarah said. "He assumed building security was the only surveillance he needed to worry about. But this city has cameras everywhere." She clicked through the images in sequence. The man arriving in a stolen pickup truck, switching to maintenance coveralls in an alley, entering the courthouse, leaving 20 minutes later, and ditching the coveralls in a dumpster 6 blocks away. "Please tell me you got a face," David said. "Better." Sarah zoomed in on the final image, showing the man removing his baseball cap. "Meet Thomas Brennan, age 47, former military explosives expert, current member of the Aryan Brotherhood." David leaned forward. "Jesus, this was organized white supremacists." "It gets worse." Sarah pulled up another file. "Brennan's been in federal prison twice, both times prosecuted by guess who?" "Don't tell me." "Assistant federal prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh. The same Walsh who's trying to keep Marcus locked up." David's coffee cup hit the floor. "She knows. Walsh knows who really planted that bomb, and she's covering it up. That's not even the best part." Sarah's fingers danced across the keyboard. "Remember how Brennan's prints weren't found anywhere on the device, but Marcus's were? I've been wondering how that was possible." She brought up a new document, a forensics report that hadn't been shared with the defense. According to the lab tech who processed the evidence, the prints on the package weren't from direct contact. They were lifted prints, transferred using tape or adhesive. David stood up, energy returning. "Someone stole Marcus's prints and planted them, and I know when." Sarah pulled up Marcus's calendar from the previous week. Tuesday morning, Marcus had a meeting with Federal Judge Morrison to discuss prison reform. He signed visitor logs, touched door handles, shook hands. Someone with access to the courthouse collected his prints after that meeting. Someone with law enforcement credentials, Sarah confirmed. Someone who could walk around the courthouse freely, collect evidence, and plant it later. David began pacing. "We need to get this to the media immediately. If Walsh is covering up a white supremacist bombing to frame Marcus's weight," Sarah held up her hand. "There's more. And this is where it gets really ugly." She brought up a series of financial records on the screen. Thomas Brennan received a $50,000 payment 3 days before the bombing, wired from an account registered to a shell company called Patriot Legal Services. Who owns Patriot Legal Services? Sarah smiled grimly. That took some digging. The ownership is hidden behind layers of LLCs and offshore accounts. But I traced the funding back to its source. The name that appeared on screen made David's blood run cold. Hawthorne Family Trust. Judge Patricia Hawthorne funded the bombing. David said slowly, "She paid white supremacists to frame Marcus for terrorism. It's worse than that." Sarah pulled up another document. The Hawthorne Family Trust has been funding extremist groups for years, not just random donations, targeted payments to specific individuals before they commit acts of violence. David stared at the evidence, his mind racing. This isn't about revenge for her brother's case. This is systematic. She's been using her position as a federal judge to identify civil rights lawyers and activists, then orchestrating attacks against them. And Walsh has been covering it up every time, Sarah confirmed. I found similar patterns in 6 other cases over the past 3 years. Civil rights lawyers accused of crimes they didn't commit, prosecuted by Walsh, sentenced by Hawthorne. Where are those lawyers now? Sarah's expression darkened. 2 are in federal prison. 1 died in custody under suspicious circumstances. 3 had their careers destroyed and left the civil rights field entirely. David felt sick. How many more are they planning to target? I found a list. Sarah brought up a document titled Priority Neutralization Targets. Marcus's name was at the top, followed by 15 other prominent civil rights attorneys, activists, and organizations. We have to get this to the FBI immediately. I already tried. The field office that would normally handle this case is run by Agent Patricia Morrison, Judge Morrison's sister. David sat down heavily. Jesus Christ, how deep does this go? Deep enough that I don't trust anyone in law enforcement right now. Sarah closed the laptops and began gathering files. We need to take this directly to the media and hope public pressure forces action. What about Marcus? He's sitting in federal custody while we're uncovering a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the justice system. Sarah looked at her watch. Judge Hawthorne scheduled his preliminary hearing for 9 a.m. tomorrow. That's in 6 hours. She's rushing it through before we can expose the truth. Not if I can help it. Sarah pulled out her phone and began dialing. I'm calling every reporter, every civil rights organization, every politician who owes Marcus a favor. By morning, there will be so much media attention on this case that Hawthorne won't be able to hide. As Sarah began making calls, David studied the evidence spread across the table. Financial records, surveillance photos, forensic reports, everything. They needed to prove Marcus's innocence and expose a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of American justice. But he also knew how the system worked. Evidence could be suppressed, witnesses could disappear, and judges could manipulate proceedings to prevent the truth from emerging. Sarah, he said as she finished her first call, make sure you send copies of everything to reporters outside this jurisdiction. If something happens to us, I want this information to survive. Sarah looked up from her phone. You think they'll come after us? They've already killed to protect this secret, David said. What's 2 more? As dawn approached, Sarah continued making calls while David prepared for what might be the most important court hearing of his career. In 6 hours, they would walk into Judge Patricia Hawthorne's courtroom knowing she was a criminal, knowing she had orchestrated the frame-up of their client, knowing she was part of a systematic effort to destroy civil rights advocacy in America. And they would have to convince the world of that truth while she controlled every aspect of the proceedings. Marcus was counting on them. More than that, every civil rights lawyer on that target list was counting on them. Justice wasn't just delayed, it was under attack. The courtroom was a powder keg. At 8:45 a.m., news vans lined the street outside. Protesters chanted on the courthouse steps, and every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, civil rights activists, and concerned citizens. David Reeves had never seen anything like it in 30 years of practice. At the defendant's table, Marcus Washington looked calm despite spending 2 nights in federal custody. He wore the same orange jumpsuit, but somehow managed to project dignity and authority, even in chains. You ready for this? David whispered. Marcus nodded toward the prosecution table, where Jennifer Walsh was frantically shuffling papers and whispering to FBI agent Patricia Morrison. They looked nervous. That's good. Judge Patricia Hawthorne entered, and the tension in the room was immediately palpable. She looked haggard, older than her 58 years, and her usually steady hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers. This preliminary hearing will come to order, she announced. We are here to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to your honor. David stood. Before we proceed, defense moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Washington based on newly discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and judicial bias. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hawthorne's gavel came down hard. Mr. Reeves, you will submit such motions through proper channels. Your Honor, the evidence we've discovered implicates officers of this court in a conspiracy to frame my client. David's voice carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. This hearing cannot proceed until these allegations are addressed. Walsh shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to delay proceedings. Delay. Sarah Chin's voice rang out from the gallery. Or expose the truth. Judge Hawthorne's face flushed red. Ms. Chen, you will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom. Then you'll have to remove every reporter here too, Sarah said, standing. They all have copies of the evidence. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, I have financial records showing that the Hawthorne Family Trust paid $50,000 to Thomas Brennan, the actual bomber, 3 days before the attack. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hawthorne went pale. Furthermore, David continued, we have evidence that Prosecutor Walsh has covered up similar frame-ups in at least 6 other cases, all targeting civil rights attorneys. Walsh stood slowly. Your Honor, defense counsel is making wild accusations. Without foundation, David slammed a photograph on the table. This shows Thomas Brennan entering the courthouse on the morning of the bombing. This shows him leaving. And this shows him depositing $50,000 in cash. The next day, Agent Morrison whispered something urgent in Walsh's ear, but Walsh shook her head. Marcus finally spoke. Your Honor, may I address the court? Mr. Washington, you are represented by counsel. I'm also an officer of this court, Marcus said, rising as much as his shackles allowed, and I have something to say about the systematic corruption of American justice. Judge Hawthorne looked trapped. Denying Marcus the right to speak would look like suppression, but letting him talk could expose everything. You have 2 minutes, she said finally. Marcus turned to face the packed gallery. 15 years ago, I took an oath to defend justice and protect the innocent. I've kept that oath by freeing 43 wrongfully convicted men, most of them black men railroaded by a system that sees guilt before evidence. His voice grew stronger, but I've learned something in the past 3 days. The corruption I've been fighting isn't random. It's systematic, it's organized, and it reaches into the highest levels of our judicial system. Mr. Washington, Judge Hawthorne warned. Judge Patricia Hawthorne has been funding white supremacist groups to target civil rights lawyers. Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. She paid Thomas Brennan to plant that bomb. She denied me reasonable bail out of personal revenge. And she's part of a conspiracy that has destroyed the careers and lives of dozens of advocates for justice. The courtroom exploded. Photographers snapped pictures while reporters frantically typed. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel repeatedly. That's contempt, she shouted. Bailiff, remove the defendant. But David stepped forward. Your Honor, everything my client just said is supported by documentary evidence that we're prepared to present. This court will not be turned into a circus. It already is a circus, Marcus said as the bailiff approached. The only question is whether justice will be served or whether corruption will be protected. Agent Morrison suddenly stood. Your Honor, I need to speak with you in chambers immediately. Judge Hawthorne looked around the chaotic courtroom, then at the sea of reporters documenting every word. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As she fled the bench, Marcus caught David's eye. Whatever Morrison is telling her, it's not good for us. David nodded. In the gallery, Sarah was coordinating with reporters, making sure the story would get out, regardless of what happened next. But David knew they were in dangerous territory. Cornered conspirators were unpredictable, and they'd already shown they were willing to kill. When court reconvened, Judge Hawthorne looked like a different person. Her face was composed, her hands steady, and her voice carried its old authority. After consulting with the FBI, she announced, I'm ordering all evidence presented by the defense to be sealed, pending a federal investigation into national security implications. David felt his stomach drop. Your Honor, this evidence proves my client's innocence. It also allegedly reveals ongoing FBI operations that could be compromised by public disclosure. Judge Hawthorne's eyes were cold. Any attorney who violates this seal order will be held in contempt. Marcus leaned forward. She's buying time to destroy evidence and silence witnesses. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne continued, given the inflammatory and unsubstantiated accusations made in this courtroom, I am finding the defendant in contempt and ordering him held without possibility of bail pending trial. The courtroom erupted again, but this time the shouting was different. Angry, dangerous. This is a cover-up. Someone yelled from the gallery. Free Marcus Washington, chanted others. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel. Clear the courtroom. Everyone out. As bailiffs moved to control the crowd, David grabbed Marcus's arm. We're not done. This evidence will come out. I know, Marcus said quietly, but they're going to try to kill me before it does. As they led him away in shackles, Marcus looked back at the chaotic courtroom. He'd spent his career believing that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. Now he understood that sometimes, good people had to fight for those ideals with everything they had. The war for justice had just begun. The explosion came at 3:17 a.m. Sarah Chen woke to her apartment windows shattering. Car alarms, screaming, and the acrid smell of smoke. She rolled off her bed onto the floor, grabbing her laptop and the backup drive containing copies of all their evidence. Outside, flames engulfed David Reeves' car in the parking lot below. If he'd been leaving her apartment 20 minutes later, as originally planned, he'd be dead. Sarah's phone rang. David's voice was shaken but controlled. Are you hurt? No, you. I'm fine. They missed. His voice hardened. But the message is clear. Sarah looked at the devastation below. Her neighbors were emerging from their apartments, some screaming, others recording everything with their phones. Fire trucks wailed in the distance. They're escalating, she said, which means we're close to something they'll kill to protect, or they're getting desperate. David paused. Sarah, I just got a call from someone who wants to meet. Someone with information about the conspiracy who Judge Elizabeth Morrison. Sarah felt her blood run cold. The same Judge Morrison whose sister is FBI agent Patricia Morrison. The same Judge Morrison who was supposedly the target of the bombing. The same one she says she has evidence that will clear Marcus and expose the conspiracy, but she wants to meet in person. It's a trap. Maybe, or maybe she's had enough of watching her sister destroy innocent people. David's voice was grim. Either way, we don't have a choice. Marcus is sitting in federal custody while they plan his next accident. Sarah grabbed her backup equipment. Where and when? 1 hour. The Lincoln Memorial. She says she chose it because it's public and symbolic. Symbolic of what? Justice delayed but not denied. The Lincoln Memorial at 4:30 a.m. was eerily quiet, bathed in harsh floodlights that cast long shadows across the marble steps. Sarah arrived first, positioning herself with clear sightlines and escape routes. Her military training had taught her to never trust anyone completely, especially in situations like this. Judge Elizabeth Morrison emerged from the darkness at exactly 4:30, walking alone. She was in her mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of lined face that came from years of making difficult decisions. Unlike her sister Patricia, who radiated corruption and cruelty, Elizabeth Morrison looked haunted. David arrived 2 minutes later, carrying a briefcase and looking like he hadn't slept in days. Judge Morrison, he said carefully. Thank you for coming. Don't thank me yet, she replied. What I'm about to tell you will destroy my family and probably end my career. But I can't stand by and watch innocent people die. She pulled out a thick manila envelope. My sister, Patricia, isn't just covering up the conspiracy, she's running it. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What do you mean? The FBI field office that's been investigating civil rights lawyers. Patricia has been feeding information to white supremacist groups for years. She identifies targets, provides personal information, and coordinates with people like Judge Hawthorne to ensure the frame-ups stick. David opened the envelope. Inside were FBI documents, financial records, and photographs showing Agent Patricia Morrison meeting with known white supremacists. Why? Sarah asked. Why would an FBI agent do this? Judge Morrison's face twisted with pain. Because she believes in it, Patricia has always been, different. Even as children, she saw the world in terms of racial hierarchies. She joined the FBI thinking she could protect what she calls traditional America and Judge Hawthorne. Patricia recruited her after Brian Hawthorne's case. Patricia convinced her that civil rights lawyers were enemies of order, that they were destroying the country by freeing criminals. Judge Morrison shook her head. She was wrong about Brian. You know, he really was innocent. David studied the documents. This proves the conspiracy goes deeper than we thought. How many others are involved? At least 12 federal judges, 37 FBI agents, and dozens of prosecutors across the country. Judge Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. They call themselves the Restoration Project. Their goal is to eliminate civil rights advocacy entirely. Sarah felt dizzy. They're not just targeting individual lawyers. They're trying to destroy the entire movement. And they're succeeding, Judge Morrison confirmed. In the past 5 years, they've destroyed 43 civil rights lawyers, disbanded 15 advocacy organizations, and intimidated hundreds of others into silence. David looked up from the documents. Why are you telling us this now? Because Marcus Washington was supposed to receive the Presidential Medal for Human Rights Advocacy. That ceremony was going to be broadcast nationwide, showing the president honoring someone who fights for justice. Judge Morrison's eyes filled with tears. Patricia couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let the country see civil rights work being celebrated. So she orchestrated the bombing to destroy Marcus and send a message to every other advocate. Exactly. But she made a mistake. She involved me by making my chambers the supposed target. She thought I'd play along, help sell the story. Judge Morrison's voice hardened. She was wrong. Sarah was studying the financial records. Judge Morrison, these payments, they're not just going to individual bombers. They're funding a network, training camps, weapons purchases, legal defense funds for arrested supremacists. Judge Morrison nodded. The Restoration Project has been building an army. David closed the file. We need to get this to the media immediately. It won't be enough, Judge Morrison said. Patricia will claim the documents are forgeries, that I'm trying to protect my reputation by scapegoating her. She used the FBI's resources to discredit everything. Then what do you suggest? Judge Morrison looked up at the statue of Lincoln, then back at them. We need to catch her in the act. Force her to reveal herself publicly in a way she can't deny. Sarah leaned forward. What did you have in mind? Tomorrow morning, Judge Hawthorne is holding a closed hearing to formally charge Marcus with terrorism. Patricia will be there to present additional evidence. I know she's planning to fabricate. How do you know? Because she asked me to provide it. She wants me to testify that Marcus threatened me personally, that he was planning to expand his bombing campaign to target multiple judges. David's face went pale. And if you refuse, then I'll have an unfortunate accident, just like the others who've refused to cooperate. Judge Morrison's voice was steady, despite the fear in her eyes. But if I agreed to testify, I can use the hearing to expose everything. That's suicide, Sarah said. The moment you start telling the truth, they'll find a way to silence you. Maybe, but it's also our only chance to save Marcus and expose the conspiracy before they kill more people. David studied the documents again. What about protection? If we're going to do this, we need to ensure you survive long enough to testify. I've been thinking about that. Judge Morrison pulled out her phone. I have contacts in the Justice Department who aren't part of the conspiracy. People who've been suspicious about the pattern of civil rights lawyers being targeted. Can you trust them? I'm going to have to. Because if we don't stop this tomorrow, Marcus Washington will be the first of many to die in federal custody. Sarah looked at her watch. We have less than 5 hours to prepare. Then we better get started, David said, gathering the documents. Judge Morrison, are you sure about this? Once you testify, there's no going back. Judge Morrison stood and looked up at Lincoln's statue one more time. Abraham Lincoln said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The Restoration Project is trying to divide this country by destroying those who fight for equality and justice. She turned back to them. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. It's time I honored that oath. As they parted ways in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the weight of what they were about to attempt. They were going to walk into a courtroom, controlled by conspirators, with a judge who had already tried to have them killed, and try to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The odds were against them. But for the first time since Marcus's arrest, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Because sometimes, the only way to save justice was to risk everything for it. The federal courthouse was surrounded by protesters at 8 a.m. Word had leaked about Judge Morrison's planned testimony, and civil rights organizations across the country had mobilized overnight. The crowd chanted Marcus Washington's name and demanded justice, their voices carrying through the morning air like a battle cry. Inside courtroom 7, Judge Patricia Hawthorne sat rigid behind the bench, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. The closed hearing was supposed to be a formality, a few FBI agents presenting fabricated evidence, a compliant judge issuing terrorism charges, and Marcus Washington disappearing into the federal prison system forever. Instead, the courtroom was packed with reporters who had somehow obtained access, federal marshals who weren't under FBI control, and Justice Department officials who looked like they were attending an execution. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in shackles, but his eyes were alert and focused. David Reeves sat beside him, a stack of documents at his fingertips. In the gallery, Sarah Chen worked frantically on her laptop, coordinating with media outlets and civil rights organizations across the country. This hearing will come to order, Judge Hawthorne announced. We are here to consider additional charges against the defendant, Marcus Washington. FBI agent Patricia Morrison stood. Your Honor, the FBI has uncovered evidence of a broader terrorist conspiracy involving the defendant and multiple civil rights organizations. What evidence? David asked, rising. Documents seized from the defendant's office, showing plans to target federal judges, prosecutors, and FBI agents. Agent Morrison held up a folder. Communications discussing the elimination of law enforcement personnel who oppose civil rights extremism. Marcus leaned forward. Those documents don't exist because I never wrote them. Silence. Judge Hawthorne's gavel came down hard. The defendant will not speak without permission. But David was already on his feet. Your Honor, defense calls Judge Elizabeth Morrison to testify about these alleged documents. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hawthorne's face went white. Judge Morrison is not relevant to these proceedings. She's extremely relevant, David said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, because she's the one who asked her to fabricate them. Agent Patricia Morrison spun around. That's a lie. Judge Elizabeth Morrison stood from the gallery. No, Patricia, the lying stops now. As she walked toward the witness stand, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Federal marshals moved subtly to block the exits. Justice Department officials leaned forward in their seats, and Judge Patricia Hawthorne looked like she was watching her world collapse. "Your Honor," Agent Morrison said desperately, "Judge Morrison is emotionally compromised. She's been under investigation for what?" Judge Elizabeth Morrison asked, taking the witness stand. "For refusing to participate in your conspiracy." David approached the witness stand. "Judge Morrison, do you swear to tell the truth about what you know regarding the framing of Marcus Washington?" "I do." Judge Hawthorne found her voice. "This is highly irregular. Judge Morrison hasn't been properly sworn." "I'll swear her in," said a new voice from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned. Deputy Attorney General Michael Chen walked down the center aisle, flanked by FBI agents who clearly weren't part of Agent Morrison's unit. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Hawthorne, "the Justice Department is taking over this proceeding under federal authority. We have evidence of a conspiracy involving officers of this court." Judge Hawthorne's mask finally slipped. "You have no authority here." "Actually, I do." Deputy Attorney General Chen held up a document. "This is a federal warrant for the arrest of FBI agent Patricia Morrison on charges of conspiracy, terrorism, and violation of civil rights under color of law." Agent Morrison backed toward the exit, but the federal marshals were already moving. "This is a setup. These people are the real terrorists." "The only terrorist here," Judge Elizabeth Morrison said from the witness stand, "is my sister." The courtroom erupted as Agent Morrison was handcuffed. Judge Patricia Hawthorne rose from the bench, but Deputy Attorney General Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "Judge Hawthorne, you're also under arrest. This is a coup." Judge Hawthorne screamed as marshals approached. "You're destroying the American justice system." "No," Marcus said, standing as his shackles were removed. "We're saving it." As the conspirators were led away, Judge Elizabeth Morrison began her testimony. She detailed the Restoration Project, the systematic targeting of civil rights lawyers, the bombing conspiracy, and the network of corrupt officials who had perverted justice in service of white supremacy. Sarah Chen live-streamed the entire proceeding, broadcasting it to millions of viewers across the country. By noon, the story was the lead on every news network, and federal agents were making arrests in 12 states. David Reeves stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against Marcus Washington." Deputy Attorney General Chen, who had taken over the proceedings, nodded. "Motion granted. All charges are dismissed. Mr. Washington is free to go." As the shackles fell away, Marcus felt the weight of 3 days of injustice lift from his shoulders, but he also felt something else, the responsibility of what came next. The courtroom was in chaos, with reporters shouting questions and supporters cheering. But Marcus walked to the witness stand, where Judge Elizabeth Morrison still sat. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank the Constitution. It survived another test." Marcus turned to face the packed courtroom. "If I may address the court." Deputy Attorney General Chen nodded. "The floor is yours, Mr. Washington." Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, activists, ordinary citizens who had come to witness justice. 3 days ago, I was supposed to receive the Presidential Medal for Human Rights Advocacy. Instead, I was arrested on fabricated charges by people who believed they could silence the fight for justice. His voice grew stronger. They were wrong. Justice isn't just about individual cases or individual lawyers. It's about the fundamental promise that every person, regardless of race or background, deserves equal treatment under the law. The courtroom was silent now, hanging on every word. The Restoration Project thought they could destroy civil rights advocacy by destroying civil rights advocates. They thought they could turn the justice system into a weapon against justice itself. Marcus paused, but they forgot something important. Justice isn't just an ideal, it's a movement. And movements don't die when individuals are silenced. He looked directly at the cameras. To every civil rights lawyer who's been targeted, every advocate who's been intimidated, every person who's been told to stay silent in the face of injustice. This is our moment. This is when we prove that truth is stronger than conspiracy, that justice is stronger than hatred, and that the arc of the moral universe really does bend toward justice, but only if we're willing to bend it. The courtroom erupted in applause. As Marcus stepped down, David grabbed his arm. "So what now?" David asked. Marcus looked around the courtroom at the handcuffs being removed from corrupt officials, at the reporters documenting the truth, at the activists who had fought for his freedom. "Now we get back to work. There are still innocent people in prison, still injustices to fight, still a system to reform, and the Presidential Medal." Marcus smiled. "I think I'll take a rain check." I've got more important things to do." As they left the courthouse, Marcus Washington walked into the bright morning sun. Behind him, the wheels of justice were finally turning in the right direction. Ahead of him, the work of justice continued. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time in days, Marcus Washington felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Because sometimes, when the system breaks down, good people fix it. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice delayed becomes justice delivered with interest. The Restoration Project had tried to destroy civil rights advocacy in America. Instead, they had given it the most powerful weapon of all, the undeniable truth that the system could be corrupted, but it could also be redeemed. And Marcus Washington intended to spend the rest of his career making sure it was